For 1600 years, a city slept under the vineyards of southern Italy, and almost no one remembered that it was there. Farmers plowed the soft gray soil above its rooftops. Grapes grew fat on the slopes that had swallowed it. Somewhere below the roots, a loaf of bread sat in a baker's oven, where he had left it, still round, still scored across the top in the way bakers scored their loaves that morning. A dog lay chained in a doorway. A woman held a child. Coins rested in an open purse on a counter, counted out and never collected. All of it was held in place by a blanket of ash that had fallen from the sky in a single day and a single night, and then hardened and then been forgotten. The mountain that did this had no reputation for danger. It was green to its summit. Vines climbed it. Wild boar lived in the woods along its upper slopes, and the people who lived in its shadow believed, so far as we can tell, that it was simply a mountain, high and pleasant and good for farming. They had a word for a burning mountain. They did not use it for this one. There had been no eruption in living memory, nor in the memory of anyone's grandparents, nor in any record they possessed. The last time it had spoken was so long ago that the language of the people who heard it had since died out. And so on an ordinary day in the late summer or early autumn of the year 79, when the sky above the Bay of Naples cracked open and a column of ash rose more than 20 miles into the air, the people below did not immediately understand what they were looking at. Some of them stood in the street and watched. Some went inside and closed the shutters. Some gathered their valuables and ran for the harbor, and some, believing the worst would pass as storms pass, took a cushion and sat down to wait. This is the story of Pompeii. It is the story of a small, loud, prosperous, quarrelsome Roman town on a fertile bay, of the ordinary lives lived in it, of the mountain that ended those lives in about 18 hours, and of the slow, strange resurrection that followed, when men with shovels went down into the ash and found a world that had been holding its breath since the reign of the Emperor Titus. Let yourself settle. Let the room grow dim. We are going to walk through this city while it is still living, and stay with it to the end. Long before there was a Rome worth the name, the Bay of Naples was already one of the most desirable stretches of coast in the Western world. It curves in a wide arc, open to the sea, sheltered from the worst of the northern weather, and everywhere along it the land runs down to the water in terraces of astonishing richness. The soil there is dark and crumbling and holds water well. It grows 2 crops where other soils grow 1. Ancient writers commented on it with a kind of envy. The vines of Campania, they said, climbed the elms until the men who picked them had to be paid extra for the risk. Cabbages grew there that were famous by name. The wheat was heavy. The olives were good. None of these writers seem to have connected that fertility to the mountain standing over it, though the connection is direct. Everything that made the land rich had come out of the ground in fire. Vesuvius had been building itself for tens of thousands of years, layer upon layer of ash and rock, and each layer had weathered down into the exact mineral cocktail that grapevines love. The people of the bay were farming the debris of old catastrophes and calling it luck. The first settlements we can identify in the area belonged to the Oscans, an Italic people who spoke a language related to Latin but distinct from it, and who left their words scratched into walls and carved into paving stones long after Latin had taken over the region. Their name for the town seems to have been something close to the word we still use. Pompeii sat on a low shelf of old lava that ended in a bluff above the river Sarno, about half a mile inland from the sea as the coast then ran. It was a natural place for a town. The bluff gave defense. The river gave a harbor. The road from the interior came down that way to the coast, and anyone who controlled the shelf controlled the traffic. Then the Greeks arrived. From the 8th century before Christ, Greek colonists were planting cities all along this coast, at Cumae and at Naples itself, and their influence washed inland like a tide. The people of Pompeii began to build in the Greek manner. They laid out a temple to Apollo. They raised a Doric temple on the high southwestern corner of the town, where the ground fell away toward the sea, so that sailors could see it from the water. They started using Greek pottery, Greek gods, Greek ideas about how a city ought to be arranged, with a public square at its heart and streets running off it in something approaching a grid. The Etruscans came too, pressing down from the north, and for a while the bay was contested between Greek fleets and Etruscan ones. Then the Samnites came down out of the mountains. They were highlanders, tough and unglamorous, and in the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, they took the Campanian plain from everyone who had it. Pompeii became a Samnite town, and it was the Samnites, more than anyone, who made it the shape we now walk through. They pushed the walls out to enclose a large area, about 160 acres, far more than the town then needed. They laid out broad, straight streets across the empty ground to the north and east. They built houses of a size and confidence that still startle people who walk into them, with high atria and colonnaded gardens and floors of colored stone. You can still see the seams. The oldest part of the town, down by the sea gate, has narrow, crooked lanes that wander the way old lanes do. Step a few streets north, and the grid snaps into place, wide and rational. The work of surveyors with rope and instrument. Pompeii grew the way a tree grows, one ring at a time, and it never quite hid the joins. By the 3rd century before Christ, when Rome began to interest itself seriously in the south, Pompeii was a substantial and confident town of perhaps 8,000 or 10,000 people. It had walls of dressed stone with a dozen towers. It had a forum, temples, a covered market. It had money, from wine and oil and the traffic of the river. It was not a great city. Naples was greater, and Capua inland was greater still. But it was comfortable, and it was old, and it had every expectation of continuing much as it was. Rome and Pompeii came into contact in the long wars against the Samnites, and when those wars ended, Pompeii found itself an allied community, technically independent, practically bound. It sent soldiers when Rome asked. It kept its own magistrates, its own language, its own laws. For roughly 2 centuries this arrangement held, and during those centuries, Pompeii grew rich on the back of Roman expansion without being Roman itself. Its merchants sold wine into markets that Roman legions had opened. Its landowners bought slaves that Roman wars had produced. The great houses of the town, the ones with the mosaic floors, and the imported marble, mostly date from this period. Pompeii was doing well out of somebody else's empire. But the arrangement had a flaw at the center of it, and in the end the flaw tore Italy apart. The allied communities of Italy fought Rome's wars and paid Rome's price, and they did not have Roman citizenship. They could not vote. They had no protection in Roman courts. When Roman magistrates behaved badly in allied towns, and they often did, there was no remedy. For decades the allies petitioned for citizenship. For decades Rome refused, because citizenship was valuable precisely in proportion to how few people had it. In the year 91 before Christ, the patience ran out, and central and southern Italy rose against Rome in what the Romans called the social war, from the Latin word for ally. It was the most dangerous war Rome had fought since Hannibal, and it was fought against people who had learned to fight in Roman armies, using Roman tactics, often under officers who had served beside the men now trying to kill them. Pompeii joined the rebellion. It was a decision the town paid for. In 89 before Christ, a Roman army came south under the command of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician of ferocious ability and no discernible mercy, and it laid siege to Pompeii. The evidence of that siege is still in the walls today, which is one of the small, hard pleasures of the place. Walk along the northern defenses near the Vesuvius gate and look up. The stone is pocked and gouged. Where ballista bolts and stone shot struck it, dozens of impacts clustered around the weak points, exactly where a competent artillery officer would have concentrated fire. Someone painted directions on nearby walls in Oscan, arrows and instructions for the defenders moving to their posts. Those painted messages are still legible. They are among the last public words in the Oscan language. The town held for a season, then fell. Rome, having beaten the Allies militarily, promptly conceded the thing they had fought for and extended citizenship across Italy, which is a very Roman way to end a war. But Pompeii was punished as well as absorbed. Around 80 before Christ, Sulla planted a colony of his own veterans in the town, perhaps 2,000 of them with their families, and gave them land. That land had to come from somewhere. It came from the Pompeians. The new settlers took houses, farms, and vineyards, and they took the magistracies too. The town's name changed formally to the Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompeianorum, which honored Sulla's family name and the goddess Venus, whom Sulla regarded as his personal patron. For a generation, the town must have been a bitter place to live. Two populations, one dispossessed and one installed, sharing the same streets. Latin replaced Oscan on the public inscriptions almost immediately, though people surely went on speaking Oscan at home for a long while. Old families disappeared from the lists of magistrates. New ones appeared. There was at least one serious political scandal in the following decades, when a Pompeian delegation went to Rome to complain about the colonists, and the great orator Cicero found himself defending the other side. And yet, within 2 or 3 generations, the wound closed. That is one of the quietly remarkable things about the Roman world. It absorbed. The grandchildren of the veterans and the grandchildren of the dispossessed married one another, and their children ran for office together. And by the time of the Emperor Augustus, Pompeii was simply a Roman country town like 100 others, prosperous, self-satisfied, and utterly unremarkable, which is exactly why it matters so much to us now. We did not lose a capital under the ash. We lost an ordinary place. Imagine walking up to it from the sea on a bright morning in the middle of the 1st century. You come along the coast road with the water on your left, and the town sits above you on its shelf of old gray lava, walls running along the crest, roofs and the tops of trees showing behind them. The Doric temple stands out on the corner. Beyond and above everything, filling the whole northern sky, is the mountain, green and broad-shouldered, with a cap of woodland on the summit. You enter by the Marine Gate, which is not one gate but 2, a wide vaulted passage for animals and carts and a narrower one beside it for people on foot. The climb is steep and the passage is dark and cool after the sun, and then you come out into the light at the top and the town is around you. The first thing that strikes anyone is the noise. Roman towns were loud, iron tires on stone paving, animals hammering from the metal workers' shops, shouting, the endless splash and gurgle of running water. The second thing is the smell, which was a compound of wood smoke, baking bread, animal dung, drains, garum, and the particular sour reek of the fuller's workshops, which used stale urine to clean cloth and collected it in jars set out on the street corners for public use. Underfoot the streets are paved in blocks of hard gray volcanic stone, fitted tight and worn into deep ruts by centuries of wheels. The pavements are high, sometimes 2 feet above the roadway, because the roadway also served as the storm drain and in heavy rain became a river. To cross a street you use stepping stones, big blocks set at intervals in the roadbed, spaced so that cart axles pass between them. It is a beautifully practical piece of engineering, and it also tells you the exact width of a Pompeian cart, because if a driver misjudged, he wedged. The town within the walls is not large. You can walk from one side to the other in about 20 minutes. Roughly 9,000 or 10,000 people lived inside, with more in the suburbs and the farms around, and the density was high in the western half and thinner in the east, where there were market gardens and vineyards inside the walls, growing food for the town. At the heart of it lies the Forum, a long rectangular open space, closed to wheeled traffic by stone bollards at every entrance. It is paved in stone and lined on 3 sides with colonnades. At the northern end, raised on a high podium and facing down the length of the square, stands the Temple of Jupiter, with the mountain framed directly behind it. Around the square are all the instruments of civic life. There is the Basilica, a great hall where legal business was done, and merchants met to argue over contracts. There is the building of Eumachia, a wealthy priestess who paid for it and put her name on it, probably used by the Guild of Fullers. There are the offices of the magistrates. There is the covered market, the Macellum, where fish and meat were sold, with a round pool in the middle where fish were kept alive. The walls of the Forum carry inscriptions, statue bases, and the ordinary chaos of public writing. Painted notices announce elections. Others announce gladiator shows. Someone has scratched a rude comment about a neighbor. The Romans wrote on walls constantly, and Pompeii preserved that habit better than anywhere, which is why we know the names of thousands of people from this town who would otherwise be nothing at all. Water arrives from an aqueduct, tapped from a branch of the great line that fed the naval base at Misenum. It comes into a castellum aquae, a distribution tank at the highest point of the town by the Vesuvius gate, and from there it is split into 3 streams by a system of sluices, one for the public fountains, one for the baths, one for private houses that had paid for a connection. If supply fell, the design cut off the private houses first, then the baths, and kept the public fountains running longest. That priority was deliberate. There were more than 40 street fountains, and no one in Pompeii lived more than about 80 yards from one. The houses turned their backs on the street. From outside, a great Pompeian house presents a blank wall and a door, sometimes with shops built into its frontage and rented out. Step through the door and you are in the atrium, a high hall with a square opening in the roof and a shallow basin in the floor beneath it to catch the rain. Beyond that, framed by the doorway of the reception room, is the garden, colonnaded, planted, often with a fountain. The whole house is arranged as a single view from the front door to the back wall, and the effect, standing on the threshold, is of looking down a tunnel of light into green shade. It is one of the most beautiful things Roman architects ever did, and they did it in a provincial town hundreds of times over. The wealth of Pompeii came out of the ground. That is the simplest way to put it, and almost everything else in the town's economy grew from it. The volcanic soil of the Sarno plain and the lower slopes of the mountain produced wine in enormous quantity. Not fine wine, mostly. Roman connoisseurs were rude about Pompeian vintages, and one writer warned that it gave you a headache that lasted until noon the following day. But it was cheap, it traveled, and there was a great deal of it. Amphorae stamped with the names of Pompeian producers have turned up in southern France, in Spain, in North Africa, and as far away as the frontier forts of Britain. Some soldier on a cold northern wall was drinking the produce of these hillsides. Around the wine grew an entire industry. Amphorae had to be made, so there were potteries. They had to be sealed with pitch and stamped. They had to be carted to the river, loaded onto barges, taken downstream to the port, transferred to seagoing ships. Every stage of that had owners, agents, freedmen managers, and slave labor, and every stage generated the kind of small fortune that let a man buy a house with a garden and put a mosaic in the entrance. Oil came from the same land. So did fruit and vegetables in quantities that fed not only Pompeii, but the towns around it. And then there was the other great Pompeian product, the one that made the town genuinely famous across the empire, which was garum. Garum was fermented fish sauce. It was made by layering small oily fish, often anchovies, with salt in stone vats and leaving them in the sun for weeks or months until the flesh broke down entirely. The liquid that drained off was strained and bottled and used the way we use salt, on almost everything. To a modern nose, the production process is nearly unbearable, and Roman law required garum works to be sited away from residential areas for exactly that reason. To a Roman palate, it was indispensable, and the best grades were luxury goods sold at high prices. Pompeii's garum was well regarded, and one producer in particular, a man named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, had made himself rich and prominent on it. His house has been found, and the floor of its entrance hall is decorated with a mosaic showing 4 garum jars, each carefully labeled with the product inside and the maker's name. A man who puts his fish sauce jars in mosaic on the floor where every visitor must walk over them is a man who is not embarrassed about where his money came from. That is worth remembering, because it was not a universal Roman attitude. In Rome itself, the old aristocracy affected to despise trade. In Pompeii, trade was simply what everybody did. The town was full of workshops. Modern excavation has identified more than 30 bakeries, and they are among the most immediately legible buildings in the whole site because the equipment survives intact. Each has a set of mills, hourglass-shaped stones of hard gray lava, the upper stone turned on the lower by a donkey or by slaves pushing wooden bars. Grain went in the top, and flour came out at the base into a channel. Beside the mills is the kneading area, and beside that the oven, a domed brick chamber with an arched mouth, indistinguishable in principle from a pizza oven in Naples today. At one bakery, the excavators found 81 carbonized loaves still inside the oven. They are round, flat, marked into 8 segments by a groove pressed across the top, with a band around the middle where a cord had been tied to help carry them. You can buy bread almost exactly that shape in Naples now. There were fulleries, where cloth was cleaned and finished. Fulling was an unpleasant, valuable, highly organized trade. Cloth was trodden in vats of water, mixed with stale urine and fuller's earth to strip the grease out of it, then rinsed, then dried on frames, then brushed and bleached over sulfur fumes. The urine came from the public jars on street corners, and the Emperor Vespasian, who reigned until the year before the eruption, notoriously taxed it. When his son objected to money from such a source, Vespasian is said to have held a coin under the young man's nose and asked whether it smelled. It did not. There were metalworkers, lamp makers, carpenters, stonecutters, dyers, perfume makers who pressed oil with flowers and resins, and shops selling everything the ancient world produced. And along every busy street, at intervals of a few doors, there were bars. The Romans called them thermopolia, and Pompeii had around 160 of them. Each is unmistakable. A masonry counter faces the street, covered in fragments of colored marble, and set into the top are large round jars sunk to their rims. Behind the counter are shelves and often a small back room with a couch or two. The jars held food, hot and cold. The shelves held cups and wine. Customers stood at the counter or leaned in the doorway, ate quickly and went on. The reason there were so many is that most Pompeians could not cook at home. Kitchens with fixed hearths existed only in substantial houses. The bulk of the population lived in rented rooms above shops or behind them, in cramped upper stories reached by narrow stairs from the street, and they had, at best, a brazier. A city where most people cannot cook is a city that eats out, and the archaeology of the drains bears this out. Sewage deposits from beneath one block of buildings have been analyzed and found to contain the remains of sea urchin, shellfish, mussels, fish of many kinds, figs, olives, eggs, nuts, and the bones of small birds. Ordinary Pompeians ate a varied diet, largely from the sea, largely bought ready-cooked at a counter, standing up. One bar, on a corner where two busy streets met, was excavated only in recent years and found with its counter paintings intact. Along the front are pictures of the things sold inside: ducks hanging by their feet, a rooster, and a small dog on a lead, painted, apparently, as a joke about the quality of the meat. Someone had scratched a rude remark about the owner beside it. Inside the jars there were fragments of duck bone, pig, goat, fish, and snails. Money moved through all of this constantly, and one house has given us an extraordinary window into it. The banker Lucius Caecilius Jucundus kept his business records on wax tablets, wooden frames filled with blackened wax and written on with a stylus. When his house burned and collapsed, a wooden chest of these tablets was carbonized rather than destroyed, and 153 of them survive. They are receipts. Jucundus ran auctions, advanced money against the goods, took a commission, and recorded each transaction with the date, the sum, and the witnesses. Through those witness lists, we can see the social structure of the town assembling itself, the same names appearing again and again: freedmen and magistrates and traders, ranked in order of status on the tablet, exactly as they would have been ranked in the room. Who were these people? The population of Pompeii divided, as Roman populations did, into three broad conditions. There were the freeborn, who might be rich or desperately poor. There were slaves, who were property, and who made up perhaps a third of the town, possibly more. And in between, in the position that gives Roman society its peculiar dynamism, there were the freed. Roman slavery was brutal, but it was not, for the household slave in a town like this, necessarily permanent. Manumission was common. A slave who had served well, or who had saved enough from his own small earnings to buy himself, might be freed by his owner, and on being freed he became a Roman citizen, not a full one. A freedman carried disabilities. He could not hold public office. He owed his former owner continuing duties and a share of respect, but his children, born free, carried none of that, and could rise as far as their money and ability took them. The result was a town in which a great deal of the visible wealth belonged to men who had been slaves, or whose fathers had been. The most famous house in Pompeii, the House of the Vetii, with its brilliant red and yellow walls, and its garden full of bronze and marble sculpture, and its notorious painting of the god Priapus weighing his enormous phallus against a bag of money by the front door, belonged to two men named Aulus Vettius Restitutus and Aulus Vettius Conviva. They shared a family name and a first name because they had been freed by the same owner and taken his. They were rich. One of them held the priesthood of the imperial cult, which was among the highest honors a freedman could reach. The house says everything about them, and what it mostly says is, "Here we are. Look at this. We made it." Women in Pompeii had no vote and no formal political role, and they were nonetheless everywhere in the town's public life. Eumachia, a priestess of Venus whose family money came from brickmaking, paid for one of the largest buildings on the Forum, and had a statue of herself set up inside it by the Fullers, presumably in gratitude. Julia Felix owned a huge property in the east of the town, part house, part rental complex with baths and gardens and shops, and when the earthquake damaged the town's public baths, she advertised hers to let. Her advertisement, painted on the outside wall, survives, offering elegant baths, shops with upper rooms, and apartments on a 5-year lease. Ordinary women worked. They kept bars, sold food, wove, sold fish, and the men who owed them money recorded the debts. In the brothels and behind the bars, women worked too, in conditions that no amount of distance should be allowed to soften. The purpose-built brothel near the Forum Baths is a small, dark 2-story building with narrow cells, stone beds, and explicit paintings above the doors. The graffiti scratched on the walls of those cells by the men who used them, and sometimes by the women who worked there, is direct and unhappy reading. Slavery and prostitution were the same institution here for many of the people involved. And through all of it ran the electoral life of the town, which was noisy, competitive, and painted on every available wall. Pompeii elected magistrates each year. 2 senior officials, the duoviri, presided over the courts and the consul. 2 junior ones, the aediles, ran the markets, the streets, the water supply, and the public buildings. Serving as an aedile was expensive, because you were expected to spend your own money on the town while in office, and it was the necessary first rung for anyone with ambition. The council itself, the Ordo, was a body of about 100 men, and membership was for life. Campaigning was done with paint. Professional sign writers went out at night with brushes and lime wash and covered the street frontages with notices, and around 3,000 of these survive. Most follow a formula. A name. The office sought an appeal to vote for him, and the name of whoever was recommending him. What makes them wonderful is who did the recommending. The fruit sellers back one candidate. The muleteers back another. The bakers, the goldsmiths, the barbers, the fishermen, the porters, the chicken sellers, all put their names to somebody. A group of men who drank late together endorsed a candidate as the late drinkers, which reads either as a joke or as a piece of sabotage by the opposition. One notice claims that all the sleepy people support a particular man. Another, endorsing a candidate, was signed by a woman named Stacia along with her neighbor. It was a small town and everybody knew everybody, and the walls preserve that in a way no formal history does. Beside the election posters, scratched rather than painted, is the private layer. Someone has written that he was here. Someone records that he made love to a girl and gives her name. Someone complains about the wine. Someone has written out the first line of the Aeneid, which appears again and again in Pompeii, because it was what every schoolboy copied. And on the wall of the basilica, in a neat hand, is a sentence that has outlived every consul of the year in which it was written. It says, roughly, that walls should fall down from holding up so much dull writing, and that it is a wonder they have not. What did they do with themselves? They bathed, first of all, constantly and socially. Pompeii had at least 4 public bath complexes, and probably more, plus a great many private ones in wealthy houses. Bathing was not a matter of getting clean quickly. It was the central leisure institution of Roman life, closer to a club than to a washroom. The pattern was standard. You undressed in a changing room with numbered niches for your clothes, watched by a slave you brought or one you hired, because thieves worked the baths, and complaints about stolen cloaks are common. Then you moved through a sequence of rooms of rising temperature. The tepidarium, warm and dry to acclimatize. The caldarium, hot and steaming, with a plunge basin and a large stone tub, where you sweated and where oil was rubbed into the skin and then scraped off with a curved bronze tool, called a strigil, taking the dirt with it. Then back down through the warm room to the frigidarium and a cold plunge, which closed the pores and ended the process. The engineering that made this possible was elegant. Furnaces burned outside the walls of the hot rooms, and their heat was drawn under the floors, which were raised on short brick pillars, and up through hollow tiles set inside the walls. The floors were so hot that bathers wore wooden clogs. Bronze boilers heated water in 3 stages so that the supply was never cold. The vaulted ceilings were fluted so that condensation ran down the grooves to the walls instead of dripping on the people below, a detail that tells you an architect had stood in one and been dripped on. Around the bathing rooms there was an exercise yard, and shops and food sellers, and a great deal of standing about talking. Men and women bathed separately, either in different buildings or in different wings or at different times of day. The Stabian Baths, the oldest in the town, had a women's section with its own entrance and its own smaller set of rooms. Then there was the theater. Pompeii had 2, side by side in the southern quarter. The large one, cut into the natural slope in the Greek manner and rebuilt in stone by 2 brothers of the Holconius family, seated around 5,000. The small one beside it, roofed, seated about 1,000 and was used for music and recitations. Behind the large theater lay a great colonnaded courtyard, originally a place for the audience to walk between performances, which by the last years of the town had been converted into barracks for gladiators. Because above all, and most famously, they went to the amphitheater. The amphitheater of Pompeii is the oldest surviving stone amphitheater in the world. It was built around 70 before Christ by 2 of the Sullan colonists, Quinctius Valgus and Marcus Porcius, who paid for it out of their own pockets and put their names on it. It sits in the far southeastern corner of the town, jammed against the walls, partly sunk into the ground so that the earth takes the weight of the seating. It held around 20,000 people, which is more than lived in Pompeii, and that is the point. On show days, the surrounding towns emptied into it. The events were gladiatorial combats, beast hunts, and executions. The gladiators were slaves, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and a certain number of free volunteers who had signed away their legal status for money and fame. They fought in match types with fixed equipment. The heavily armored Murmillo with his big shield and short sword against the lightly armed Retiarius with his net and trident, the Thracian with his curved blade. Each had a trainer, a diet, a market value, and a career, and the good ones had followings. The walls of Pompeii carry their names and records. One inscription tracks a fighter through his bouts, wins, draws, and reprieves. Another calls a Thracian the sighing of the girls. Another calls a net fighter the master of the young women. Someone scratched these things on a wall and went home. And in the year 59, this same amphitheater produced the one event in Pompeii's history that got the town into the national record before the mountain did. During a show, a quarrel broke out between Pompeians and visitors from the neighboring town of Nuceria. Insults became stone throw. Stone throwing became a general brawl with weapons, and the Nucerians, being outnumbered and away from home, got much the worse of it. Many were killed. The wounded were carried back to Nuceria, and Nuceria complained to Rome. The Senate investigated, and the punishment was severe. Pompeii was banned from holding gladiatorial games for 10 years. Its local associations were dissolved, and the organizer of the show was exiled. The historian Tacitus recorded the whole affair, and someone in Pompeii, entirely unrepentant, painted a picture of the riot on the wall of a house. It is still there. You can see the amphitheater from above, the awnings, the food stalls outside, and the little figures fighting up the steps and out into the street. Religion in Pompeii was not a thing people went to on particular days. It was woven through the fabric of the town so completely that separating it out is almost artificial. At the head of the forum stood the temple of Jupiter, and in the last decades it served the Capitoline triad, Jupiter with Juno and Minerva, the state gods of Rome. It was the official religion of the town in its official space, and its rituals were performed by magistrates rather than by a separate priestly class. Because in the Roman conception, the running of a city and the keeping of its gods' content were the same job. Older and dearer to the Pompeians was Venus. She was the town's patron. Imposed formally by Sulla but adopted with real affection, and her temple stood on the southwestern edge overlooking the sea. Sailors coming into the bay saw it first. It was being rebuilt on a grander scale when the eruption came, and the work was never finished. The Temple of Apollo, beside the Forum, was older than anything Roman in the town, going back to the Greek influence of the 6th century before Christ. In front of it stood bronze statues of Apollo the archer and his sister Diana, drawn back and aiming across the open court at one another. Both survive. There was a temple of Fortuna Augusta, paid for by a private citizen. There was a sanctuary of the household gods of the town. There was a shrine to the imperial cult, because the emperors, dead ones officially and living ones in careful euphemism, received honors as divine, and holding a priesthood in that cult was one of the few high public roles open to freedmen. And there was the Temple of Isis, which is one of the most affecting buildings on the site. Isis was Egyptian, and her worship had spread across the Mediterranean over centuries, carried by traders and sailors and slaves. She offered something the state religion did not. The Roman gods were powers to be bargained with. Isis was a goddess who had suffered, who had lost her husband and gathered the pieces of him and restored him to life, and who promised her initiate something on the other side of death. Her cult had rituals of purification, water carried from the Nile, daily services at dawn and in the afternoon, music, and an inner circle of initiates who had passed through a ceremony they were forbidden to describe. Her temple in Pompeii was small, elaborately painted, with a little roofed structure in the courtyard, covering a basin of holy water and a stair down to it. It had been flattened in the earthquake of the year 62, and it was the first public building in the entire town to be completely rebuilt. The inscription over the door records who paid. A man named Numerius Popidius Celsinus restored the temple from the foundations at his own expense, and in return the town council enrolled him in their number without fee. He was 6 years old. That inscription is a small masterpiece of social maneuver. Celsinus's father was a freedman and could never sit on the council himself. His son was freeborn and could. So the father paid for the temple, put the boy's name on it, and bought his family a permanent place in the governing class of Pompeii at the price of one building in a single move. Somewhere in that house there was a very shrewd man. Beneath and beside all this public religion lay the domestic kind, which mattered more to most people day by day. Almost every house in Pompeii, from the greatest down to modest workshops, has a lararium. It is a shrine, sometimes a niche in a wall, sometimes a little painted temple front with columns and a pediment, usually near the kitchen or in the atrium. In it stand the household gods, the lares, small bronze or terracotta figures of young men in short tunics, dancing with drinking horns raised. Beside them the genius of the household, the spirit of the family line, shown as a figure with his head veiled, pouring an offering, and often painted below a serpent coiling toward an altar, representing the protective spirit of the place itself. Offerings were made at these shrines constantly, at meals, at departures, at every turning point in family life. A boy coming of age dedicated the small protective amulet he had worn since infancy. A bride entering her new home greeted the gods of the house. Food was set out. It cost almost nothing, and it happened every day. And it is probably the truest picture of what religion actually was to a Pompeian. Then there were the dead, and the Pompeians put them where they could not be forgotten. Roman law forbade burial inside the walls of a town, so the cemeteries ran along the roads leading out of the gates, and the tombs were built to face the traffic. Walk out of the Herculaneum gate to the north, and you are immediately in a street of the dead, lined on both sides for hundreds of yards. There are tombs like small temples, tombs with benches built into them where travelers could rest, tombs shaped like altars, tombs with portrait statues of the deceased standing in niches and looking out at you. Their inscriptions talk. They give the name, the offices held, the honors voted by the council, the size of the funeral banquet the man had paid for. One records a magistrate who gave a show of 30 pairs of gladiators and a beast hunt. Another belongs to a woman honored with a burial place at public expense. Another was set up by a freedman for the patron who had freed him. Many end by recording the exact dimensions of the plot. So many feet along the road, so many feet back, because status was measured in frontage. The Romans returned to these tombs. On the festivals of the dead in February and May, families came out with food and wine and ate at the graveside, sharing the meal with the deceased through a pipe or opening cut into the tomb so that the offering could be poured down to the ashes below. The benches on the roadside tombs were not decoration. People sat on them. One house in Pompeii is grander than all the others, and it was already ancient when the town died. The House of the Faun occupies an entire block near the Forum, some 3,000 square meters, which is larger than a good many royal palaces of later ages. It was built in the 2nd century before Christ, when Pompeii was still Samnite, by a family of enormous local wealth, and it was never subdivided or downgraded in the centuries that followed. It has 2 atria, one for public business and one for the family. It has 4 dining rooms, arranged so that one could be used in each season, following the sun. It has 2 colonnaded gardens, the further of which is the size of a small public square. Its entrance floor carries the word welcome, laid out in colored stone, and in the basin of the first atrium stands the small dancing bronze satyr, from which the house takes its modern name, arms raised, head thrown back, caught mid-step. And on the floor of one of its rooms, between the 2 gardens, lay the finest mosaic that survives from the ancient world. It shows a battle. On the right, a Persian king in a chariot, turning to look back, his driver already whipping the horses away. His face is one of the great faces in ancient art. Not frightened exactly, but stricken, the expression of a man watching a day go wrong beyond repair. Around him, his cavalry are collapsing inward. One of his men has dismounted and given the king his own horse and stands there, having done it. On the left, driving in with his hair loose and his eyes fixed, is Alexander of Macedon, spear leveled, already through the Persian line, having just run a nobleman through. It is made of something like 1.5 million tesserae, some of them barely a millimeter across, in a restricted palette of 4 colors, and it is almost certainly a copy in stone of a lost Greek painting made not long after the battle it shows. A family in a provincial Italian town commissioned that in the 2nd century before Christ and walked over it every day. 10,000 people lived in Pompeii, and one of them owned this. The gap between the House of the Faun and the barred room with the rope bed is the whole social range of the Roman world, expressed within a 20-minute walk. The other house that everyone knows lies outside the walls, up the road toward Herculaneum. The Villa of the Mysteries is a large country house, comfortable rather than palatial, with farm buildings attached, and a wine press in the working quarter. In one of its rooms runs a painted frieze, life-sized figures on a background of deep saturated red, moving around all 4 walls in a single continuous scene. Nobody knows for certain what is happening in it. There is a woman arriving. There is a child reading from a scroll, while a seated woman guides him. There are offerings and a Silenus playing a lyre, and a young satyr looking into a bowl held up before him. There is a figure recoiling in evident terror, hand up, cloak swirling. There is a winged woman with a raised whip, and beside her, a girl kneeling with her head in another woman's lap, being struck or about to be. There is a woman dancing, naked, arms above her head, and in the middle of it all, half reclining against the goddess beside him, is the god Dionysus, drunk and entirely at ease. The usual reading is that this is an initiation into the mysteries of Dionysus, the sequence of ordeals and revelations through which a woman entered his cult. Other readings make it a wedding preparation, or a general allegory, or a copy of a Greek original whose meaning was already opaque to the people who commissioned it. What is not in doubt is the quality. The figures are drawn with a confidence and a psychological weight that would not appear again in European painting for 15 centuries. And the room, entered from the bright garden, still stops people in the doorway. If you want to understand how a Pompeian saw the world, look at what he put on his walls. Almost every room in the town was painted, not hung with pictures, painted from the skirting to the ceiling in continuous decorative schemes that treated the wall as a single designed surface. This was true of grand houses and of modest ones, of bedrooms and of shops, and it was true because plaster had to go on the wall anyway, and the marginal cost of coloring it was not large. A house with plain white walls in Pompeii was a house whose owner had run out of money, or whose decorators had not yet arrived. Scholars sort these schemes into 4 broad styles, a system devised in the 19th century and still in use. And while the boundaries between them are argued over endlessly, the sequence is real and you can see it with your own eyes as you walk from an old house to a new one. The first style is the oldest, going back to the days when the town was Samnite. It does not paint pictures at all. It imitates masonry. The plaster is molded into blocks and courses and cornices, and then colored to look like expensive imported marbles, deep reds and yellows and greens and mottled purples. The idea is straightforward. Stone facing is what a palace has. And if you cannot afford stone facing, you can afford a plasterer who is good at pretending. Whole rooms in the older houses are done this way, and in a low light. With lamps, the illusion is convincing. The second style comes in during the 1st century before Christ, and does something much stranger. It keeps the pretend architecture but pushes it back, opening the wall into imaginary space. Columns appear to stand in front of the surface, casting painted shadows. Between them, doors open onto porticos that are not there, and beyond those, landscapes recede into blue distance, with temples and trees and little figures walking. The room is made to feel like a pavilion with the walls removed. The great frieze in the Villa of the Mysteries belongs to this world, and so do some of the finest rooms at Oplontis, where painted colonnades march away into depths that would be impossible in any real building. The third style, arriving under Augustus, closes the wall again. The taste turns flat and elegant and restrained. Large panels of intense single color, black or vermilion or a particular deep yellow, are framed by candelabra and slender ornamental columns too thin ever to hold anything up. And in the center of each panel floats a small, exquisite picture, a myth, a landscape, a pair of lovers. It is the most tasteful of the styles, and to some eyes the coldest. The fourth style is what most of Pompeii was wearing when it died, because it was the fashion during the great rebuilding after the earthquake. It takes everything from the earlier 3 and puts it together with no restraint whatsoever. Solid panels of color and impossible architecture, and floating figures and theatrical fantasy all appear in the same scheme. Fragments of buildings hang in the air. Painted curtains are drawn back to reveal painted stages. The House of the Veti is the classic example, and standing in its main reception room is a little like standing inside a very expensive firework. Then there are the garden rooms, which are something else again, and which are perhaps the most purely delightful things in the town. The Pompeians loved gardens and did not have much room for them, so they painted them. In the House of the Golden Bracelet, and most famously in the villa at Prima Porta outside Rome, an entire enclosed room is covered on all four walls with a painted garden seen through a painted fence, and the effect is of standing in a low-walled enclosure with an orchard beyond it. There are pomegranates and quinces and oleander and roses and irises and date palms. There are birds in the branches, and they are painted with such precision that ornithologists have identified more than 20 species, including thrushes, doves, magpies, orioles, and a hoopoe. Some are perched, some are in flight. One is stealing fruit. A person lay in that room in the heat of the afternoon, in a house in a dusty, noisy town, and looked at a garden that could not wilt. The real gardens were carefully made too. Excavators working in Pompeii from the 1960s onward developed a technique for finding them, which was to look for cavities left by roots in the ash, exactly as Fiorelli had looked for the cavities left by people, and to cast them. From those root casts, and from pollen and seeds and carbonized wood, the planting of individual gardens has been reconstructed almost bed by bed. There were fruit trees, figs and cherries and apples. There were vines trained on frames. There were vegetable plots in the gardens of ordinary houses and formal beds in the grand ones. Box hedges, ivy, myrtle, roses grown for sale as much as for pleasure. Some large properties inside the walls were essentially commercial vineyards, and one of them has been replanted in the ancient beds and produces wine today. Water ran through the good gardens. Once the aqueduct arrived, a wealthy household could have a fountain that played continuously, and they did, sometimes several, feeding channels and basins and little cascades stepped down through the planting. There are gardens with painted walls, real trees, marble tables, bronze statues of boys with dolphins, and running water, all inside a house whose front door opens onto a street where carts are grinding past a bar. That contrast is Pompeii exactly. The people who lived in those rooms were born, raised, taught and doctored in ways we can partly reconstruct, and the picture is affectionate and harsh at once. Childbirth was the most dangerous thing that happened to Pompeian women, and it happened often. Families were large by necessity because child mortality was appalling. Analysis of the skeletons and the tomb inscriptions across the Roman world suggests that something close to a third of children died before their first birthday, and that perhaps half did not reach 10. A woman who wanted 3 surviving children could expect to give birth 6 times. The tombs record it in their own way, and so do the household shrines. And so does the sheer quantity of small protective amulets found in the town, worn on cords around children's necks against the evil eye. Medicine was practiced seriously and by people who knew a certain amount. In one house, known now as the House of the Surgeon, a set of instruments was found that is startling to look at. There are scalpels with detachable blades, forceps, probes, hooks for retracting tissue, a bone drill, spatulas, needles, and a set of specula. They are made of bronze, they are well designed, and several of the shapes did not change in any meaningful way until the 19th century. A Roman surgeon could set a fracture, drain an abscess, remove a bladder stone, extract an arrowhead, and operate on cataracts. And the survival rates for some of these procedures were not as bad as one might fear, because a surgeon in a town like this had seen a great many injuries. What he could not do was anything about infection or internal disease. So alongside the instruments there was a pharmacy of herbs and compounds, some effective and some not, and alongside that there was religion. The god of healing, Asclepius in Greek, had a following here. People made offerings in the shape of the part of the body that hurt, little terracotta ears and eyes and legs and wombs, and left them at the shrine. And the fact that a surgeon with good bronze scalpels probably did this too is not a contradiction. It is how people live. Children who survived were educated according to what their parents could pay. There were no school buildings. Teaching happened wherever a teacher could find space, in a rented room, in a colonnade, in the corner of the forum, with a curtain hung up against the noise. A painting from Pompeii shows exactly this. A schoolmaster in the open. Pupils sitting on benches with tablets on their knees, and at one side a boy being flogged, held by two others, while a third applies the strap. Roman education used the strap constantly, and nobody thought it remarkable. What was taught was reading, writing, arithmetic, and then, for those who went further, literature and rhetoric. Rhetoric was the finishing school of the elite, the training that let a man speak in a court or a council. And it was the single most valuable skill a Pompeian who wanted office could acquire. The graffiti of the town shows the lower rungs of that ladder. There are alphabets scratched on walls in a child's hand. There are lines of Virgil, copied out and often garbled, because that was the standard exercise. There are people practicing their signatures. There are also thousands of scrawls by people whose spelling shows they had a year or two of schooling, and no more, which is itself the important fact. In this town, a very large number of ordinary people, including slaves, could read and write a little, and did on every wall they passed, and they died young by our standards, though not as young as the raw averages suggest. The averages are pulled down by infant mortality. A Pompeian who reached 20 could reasonably expect to see 50, and a fair number reached 70 and are recorded on their tombstones as having done so, with the number given proudly and in many cases rounded up. None of this town would have existed without the sea and the road and the river. Pompeii sat at a junction. The coastal highway running south from Naples toward Nuceria and the interior passed by, and the roads out of the eastern gates ran up into the fertile hinterland where the estates were. The Sarno came down from the mountains behind and reached the sea just below the town, navigable by shallow barges, so that goods could be floated down from inland and transferred at Pompeii to seagoing ships. The port itself has never been properly located, which is one of the standing frustrations of the site, because the coastline moved so drastically in the eruption. It lay somewhere below the southwestern walls, a river-mouth harbor rather than a great engineered basin, with quays and warehouses and the usual clutter of a working waterfront. From it, wine and oil and garum went out. Into it came everything else. And everything else was a great deal, because this was a town plugged directly into the largest free trade area the ancient world ever built. In the shops and houses of Pompeii, archaeologists have found glass from Syria, fine red pottery from Gaul and from Arezzo in Tuscany, marble from Greece and Africa and Asia Minor, obsidian, amber from the Baltic, spices, and, in one house, a small carved ivory figure of an Indian goddess that had come along the trade routes from the subcontinent, changing hands who knows how many times, to end up on a shelf in a provincial Italian town. Ordinary Pompeians ate food from all over the Mediterranean, drank wine from Crete and Spain as well as their own, cooked in pans made in one province with oil pressed in another, and thought nothing of it. The empire, whatever else it was, and it was many bad things, had made the Mediterranean into a single market with one currency, no internal tariffs to speak of, suppressed piracy, and a road network that let a letter cross from Rome to the bay in a couple of days. Travel was slow and dangerous but constant. Sailing was seasonal, largely shut down between November and March. On land, a person walked or rode a mule, or, if wealthy, was carried. Inns existed along the roads and had a terrible reputation, and one of the pleasures of Pompeian graffiti is finding the ancient equivalent of a bad review. A traveler records that he had a good time at an inn, and that the landlord cheated him on the wine. Another complains about the bedbugs. The town's own inns and lodging houses clustered near the gates, especially the Stabian and Nucerian gates on the landward side, where a man arriving late from the interior would want a bed. They had stables, a bar at the front, rooms above, and a considerable amount of trouble, judging by the graffiti and by the number of dice found in them. And through this traffic came ideas as well as goods. The Egyptian gods arrived this way. So did new fashions in painting and hairstyles, which can be dated with some precision because Pompeian women followed the styles of the imperial family in Rome, and the imperial family appears on coins. So, quite possibly, did the very first stirrings of Christianity, though the evidence for it in Pompeii is thin and much argued over. There is a word square scratched on a wall that can be rearranged into a Latin phrase with Christian associations, and there is a disputed charcoal inscription, and that is essentially all. It would not be surprising if there had been a few Christians in a port town of this kind in the 70s of the 1st century. It would not be surprising if there were none. What matters is the shape of the thing. Pompeii was small, and it was not isolated. A man could stand in his bar on the Via dell'Abbondanza, serving hot food out of a jar to a porter, using a bronze ladle cast in one province and a cup fired in another, taking a coin with the head of an emperor he would never see, and talking about the price of wine. That was the world the mountain interrupted. Step outside the walls and the character of the place changes completely, and this is the half of Pompeii that visitors almost never see, because most of it is still under the fields. Beyond every gate, the town thinned into suburbs and then into farmland, and that farmland was worked hard. The plain of the Sarno and the lower slopes of the mountain were covered with estates, and archaeologists have identified well over 100 rural buildings in the buried zone. Most of them found by accident during roadworks and construction over the past 2 centuries. Most of them recorded briefly and covered over again. They fall into 2 kinds. There were the pleasure villas, the ones belonging to rich outsiders who wanted a view and a garden and a place to be cool in August. And there were the working farms, which the Romans called villae rusticae, and which were factories for turning land into wine. The working farms are the interesting ones. A typical example, and there is a beautifully preserved one at Boscoriel on the slope above the town, is built around a courtyard with a well. On one side are the living quarters of the owner, or more often the manager, Modest, a few painted rooms. On the other sides is the equipment, and the equipment is serious. There is a press room with a great wooden beam press, a lever 20 feet long, anchored at one end and weighted at the other, used to squeeze the last juice from grapes already trodden. Beside it the treading floor, sloped with a channel running out of it. Below that a sunken yard, open to the sky, in which are set the mouths of dozens of enormous earthenware jars, buried to the neck in the ground so that the earth would keep the fermenting wine at an even temperature. One farm has more than 80 of these jars. Their combined capacity runs into tens of thousands of liters, and that is a single property's annual output. There is a separate press for olives and a mill for crushing them. There are threshing floors. There are stables, storerooms, a bakery for the workforce, and a bath suite, because even a working farm had one. And there are the quarters where the labor lived, which are small plain rooms without decoration, often around a separate yard, sometimes with a lock on the outside. Rural slavery was the hard end of Roman slavery. A household slave in the town lived in the same building as the family, ate the same bread, might be freed, might be remembered in a will. A slave on an agricultural estate was a unit of production, worked in gangs under an overseer, and could expect nothing. Roman writers on farming discuss this openly, and at length in the tone of men discussing machinery. One recommends selling off old or sick slaves along with worn-out tools and surplus animals, since keeping anything that does not produce is waste. At one villa near Pompeii, excavators found iron fetters. At another, a set of shackles designed for the ankles of several people at once. The wine those hands produced went into amphorae stamped with the estate's mark, was carted down to the river or the coast road, and sailed away. Some of it came back to the town in the jars behind the bar counters, and someone stood at that counter and drank it and complained about it, and neither of them ever thought about the other. The harvest season is worth pausing on, because it is very likely the season in which the town died. The vintage in Campania runs from the end of September into late October, depending on the year and the slope and the grape. It is the busiest and most sociable moment in the agricultural calendar. Extra hands are hired. The whole rhythm of the estate changes to a race against weather and rot. Grapes come in by the cartload and go straight to the treading floor. The must runs down into the jars and begins to work, and for a few weeks the countryside smells of it. Everyone is tired and everyone is paid. In the buried farms around Pompeii, the excavators have repeatedly found the fermentation jars full or partly full, sealed and working, with the harvest of the year 79 inside them. In some, the lids were still on. In others, the jars were open and being tended. That, more than any manuscript reading, is why most scholars have moved the date of the eruption from August into the autumn. The land was in the middle of its year's work. There is one more thing the countryside gives us, and it is a sobering one. The refugees who ran out of the gates as the pumice began to fall did not run into empty space. They ran into this landscape, along roads between vineyards, past farms, toward the coast or toward Nuceria in the east. And the surges that came down in the second half of the night did not stop at the town walls. They went out across the plain. Wherever the modern excavation of these rural sites has been careful enough to look for them, bodies have been found. At the villa of Civita Giuliana, just outside the walls, they have been found in the corridors and the stable yard. At Boscoriel, in the press room, along the road to Stabiae, where a party appears to have been caught in the open. They lie in the direction of travel, facing away from the mountain. So the picture we have of Pompeii, in which a walled town is buried, and everything outside it is background, is wrong in a way that matters. What was destroyed was a district. It had a market town at the center of it, a working port, resort villas along the shore, 100 farms, a road network, a river with barges on it, and perhaps 20,000 people spread across the whole. The town is simply the part that was best preserved and easiest to dig. Pompeii was not alone on its bay, and to understand what happened in the year 79, you have to see the whole crowded coastline, because the mountain did not destroy a town. It destroyed a landscape. 4 miles northwest of Pompeii, on the other side of the mountain's southern foot, sat Herculaneum. It was smaller, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 people, and it was richer per head. It sat directly on the coast on a spur between 2 streams, with the sea at the base of its walls and a small harbor front where boats were drawn up. Its buildings were finer, its streets cleaner, its houses better appointed. Where Pompeii was a market town full of workshops and carts and noise, Herculaneum was a residential place, quieter, with fewer bars and less industry, the sort of address a wealthy family from Naples might keep for the summer. Herculaneum has given us things Pompeii could not, because it was buried differently, and we will come to why. Its wooden furniture survives, its doors survive, its roof beams survive, carbonized but whole. In one house, a wooden screen still stands where it was, and in another, a baby's cradle, and in another, a set of shelves with the pots still on them. And in a great villa on the edge of the town, the so-called Villa of the Papyri, a library of around 1,800 scrolls was carbonized into black cylinders that scholars have been trying to read for 2.5 centuries, and are only now beginning to read successfully with imaging technology that can see ink inside a rolled lump of charcoal. Along the coast between the two towns and beyond ran the villas. The Bay of Naples was the most fashionable resort in the Roman world, and the wealthiest men in the empire built there. At Oplantis, a few miles from Pompeii, stands a villa of extraordinary scale and beauty, with painted rooms opening onto gardens and a swimming pool over 60 meters long, which may have belonged to the family of Poppaea Sabina, the second wife of the emperor Nero. At Stabiae to the south, on a ridge with a long view over the whole bay, a row of great villas stood side by side, each with terraces and porticos turned to the water. And at the far northwestern tip of the bay, some 20 miles across the water from Pompeii, lay Misenum, which was not a resort but a naval base. The main fleet of the western Mediterranean was stationed there. Dozens of warships and thousands of men, and in the summer of the year 79, its commander was a man in his mid-50s named Gaius Plinius Secundus, whom we call Pliny the Elder. Pliny was one of the most curious men who ever lived, in both senses of the word. He was a career officer and administrator who had served on the German frontier and in Spain, a friend of the Emperor Vespasian, and a scholar of terrifying industry. He had written a history of the German wars, a work on the use of the javelin from horseback, a biography, a grammar, and a history of Rome in 31 books, all of which are lost. What survives is his natural history, 37 books attempting to record everything known about the physical world, from astronomy to geography, to zoology to metals, to painting to medicine. Drawn from more than 2,000 volumes by other writers, all of it stitched together and annotated in his relentless, opinionated, credulous, magnificent voice. His nephew, whom he had adopted, later described how he worked. He rose in the middle of the night to study. He was read to during meals and while being dried after a bath. He traveled in a chair rather than on foot, so that his hands were free to write, with a secretary beside him carrying tablets and wearing gloves in cold weather, so that the cold could not interrupt the dictation. He considered any time not spent working to be time lost. He believed there was no book so bad that some good could not be got out of it. That nephew, Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, whom we call Pliny the Younger, was 17 years old in August of the year 79. And he was staying with his uncle and his mother at Misenum. 25 years afterward, the historian Tacitus wrote to him asking for an account of how his uncle had died. He replied in 2 letters. They are the only eyewitness description we possess of the eruption of Vesuvius. They are among the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. Before we come to that day, we have to understand that the mountain had already spoken once and that nobody had listened. On the 5th of February in the year 62, a violent earthquake struck the Bay of Naples. Seneca, the philosopher, was writing in Rome at the time and included an account of it in a book on natural questions. He records that Pompeii was largely brought down, that Herculaneum was badly damaged, that Naples suffered, and that a flock of 600 sheep died in the open, apparently from breathing something that came out of the ground. He notes that people ran out of their houses and then ran back in, and that some of them lost their minds and wandered. He argues, at length and with feeling, that earthquakes are natural, that no place is truly safe, and that fearing them is irrational, which is the sort of thing a philosopher can write when he lives 150 miles away. The damage in Pompeii was severe. The temples on the Forum were wrecked. The great public buildings cracked. Water pipes broke, the aqueduct was disrupted, houses collapsed. 2 marble reliefs from the household shrine of the banker Iucundus show the earthquake in progress, or rather show the buildings in the act of falling. The temple of Jupiter tilting off its podium, the arches beside it leaning, the equestrian statues sliding, and a mule and cart tumbling over. He put them up in gratitude for surviving, and then Pompeii began to rebuild, and it was still rebuilding 17 years later. This is one of the strangest and most human aspects of the whole story. The town that Vesuvius buried was a building site. Everywhere the excavators dig, they find scaffolding, stacks of new tiles, piles of lime, half-finished walls, columns taken down and not yet re-erected, and rooms that had been stripped of their marble facing, so it could be used somewhere more urgent. The Temple of Jupiter, the very heart of the town's public religion, was still not fully restored. The Forum baths were working. The central baths were half-built and had never been used. Private houses had been repaired first, and quickly, because a house is a home. Public buildings which required decisions and committees and money voted by the council moved slowly. Some people did not rebuild at all. A number of the grandest houses in the town appear to have changed character in these years, subdivided or converted to commercial use, or taken over by new owners with different money. There are signs that some old families left after 62 and did not come back, and that others, often freedmen with cash, moved in and bought up the wreckage cheaply. The House of the Veti itself is a product of these years. If you want to know why Pompeii in its final form looks like a town run by the newly rich, this is the reason, and the ground did not go quiet. Smaller shocks continued through those 17 years, some of them serious. There was another significant earthquake apparently in the early 70s that undid some of the repairs. The Pompeians had begun to accept tremors the way people in earthquake country always do, as a nuisance and a fact. Then, in the last days before the eruption, the tremors grew frequent. Pliny the Younger mentions this specifically. He says that for several days beforehand there had been earth shocks, but that these caused less alarm than they should have, because tremors were common in Campania, and nobody thought much of them. Other things happened too, and we know about them because they left traces. Springs and wells in the area dried up or ran strangely. Some scholars have suggested that the aqueduct supply failed in the final days, because the water tank in the town was found empty and under repair. There are accounts, gathered later, of animals behaving oddly. But nobody understood the sequence, because nobody had the concept. The word volcano did not exist. Vesuvius was not known to be a volcano. Strabo, the Greek geographer, writing nearly a century earlier, had actually looked at the summit and noticed that the rock up there was scorched and cindery as though eaten by fire, and had reasoned that the mountain must once have burned and had gone out for want of fuel. It was a brilliant observation and an entirely wrong conclusion, and there is no evidence that anybody in Pompeii had read it or would have cared. What the people of the bay knew was that the ground shook sometimes, that it had shaken badly once in living memory, and that afterwards life had gone on. So when the shocks came again in the summer of the year 79, they carried on baking bread, pressing grapes, painting walls, and putting up scaffolding on the temple of Jupiter. There was a harvest coming. The vintage had to be brought in. We are not entirely sure what day it was. The manuscripts of Pliny the Younger's letter, copied and recopied through the Middle Ages, give the date as the 9th day before the calends of September, which is the 24th of August. That reading is not secure. Different manuscripts give different numbers, and for a long time scholars have suspected that a copyist somewhere lost a stroke of ink. The physical evidence leans the other way. The bodies in the ash wore heavier clothing than August in southern Italy would suggest. The fruit found in the town includes pomegranates, walnuts, figs, and chestnuts, which ripen in the autumn. Wine had been pressed and was already fermenting in jars in the farms outside the walls, and the grape harvest in Campania falls in September and October, not August. The prevailing wind that day blew hard to the southeast, which is unusual in August and normal in the autumn. And in 2018, the excavators of a house on a street then being cleared found a charcoal inscription, a scribbled note of the kind workmen leave, dated to the 16th day before the calends of November, which is the 17th of October. Charcoal writing does not survive long. It must have been recent, so the best guess now is that this happened in the middle of the autumn, probably on the 24th of October, in the first year of the reign of the Emperor Titus, who had come to power 10 weeks earlier. But the precise day matters less than what it looked like from the ground, and about that, we can be far more confident, because two lines of evidence agree with one another to an almost uncanny degree. One is the letters of a 17-year-old boy watching from across the bay. The other is the layered deposit itself, which volcanologists have read like the pages of a book, because that is exactly what it is. The morning was ordinary. Whether August or October, it was warm. The shops opened. The bakers had been up since before dawn, and the ovens were lit. In one bakery, the loaves went in. At the central baths, the builders arrived to continue work that had been going on for 17 years. Somewhere in the town, a small dog was chained in a doorway, as it was every day. Out at Misenum, 20 miles across the water, Pliny the Elder had come off duty, taken a cold bath, eaten, and settled down with a book. Around the middle of the day, the mountain opened. What had been happening beneath it for centuries was this. A body of magma had been rising and cooling and accumulating in a chamber several miles down, becoming steadily more viscous and steadily more charged with dissolved gas. The rock plugging the vent above it had been holding that pressure the way a cork holds a shaken bottle. The earthquake of the year 62 and the tremors that followed it were the sound of that system failing slowly, and at last, on this morning, the plug gave way. When it went, the pressure on the magma dropped instantly, and every bubble of dissolved gas in it came out of solution at once. The magma tore itself apart from the inside into a spray of froth and shattered rock, and that spray came up the vent at a speed that has been estimated in the hundreds of meters per second and burst into the sky. Pliny the Younger's mother saw it first and pointed it out to his uncle. He describes the shape in the single most famous simile in the literature of natural disaster. A cloud, he says, of unusual size and appearance, which rose like a tree, specifically like a stone pine, on a very long trunk and spread out at the top into branches. It was white in some places, he says, and in others dirty and stained, according to whether it was carrying earth and ash. He got it exactly right, and volcanologists still use the word Plinian to describe eruptions of this type in his honor. The column rose because the mixture leaving the vent was so hot that it heated the air it entrained, and the heated air, being lighter than the atmosphere around it, carried the whole mass up. It went up perhaps 15 miles at first, and later further, until it hit the ceiling of the lower atmosphere and could rise no more. And there it flattened and spread sideways into the branches Pliny saw. Then everything that column carried began to come down. The wind that day was blowing from the northwest, hard and steady, and it carried the cloud directly over Pompeii. Herculaneum, on the western flank, was almost entirely spared at this stage, which is a fact that will matter terribly in a few hours. But over Pompeii the sky darkened, and then it began to rain stone. The first fall was a fine white ash, and then within a short time it became pumice, pale gray lumps of frothed volcanic glass, most of them the size of a walnut or smaller. Pumice is extraordinarily light. It floats on water. Individually, the pieces were harmless, and the earliest ones would have bounced off a roof or a shoulder with no more force than a hailstone. But it did not stop. It fell at a rate of something like 15 centimeters an hour after hour after hour, and it accumulated. Here is what that means in the streets. By the middle of the afternoon, there is a foot of pumice on the ground. Doors that open outward can no longer be opened. Doors that open inward can, but every time you open one, more comes in. By late afternoon, the drifts against walls are up to the waist. Carts cannot move. Animals cannot walk. The pumice is not hot enough to burn, but it is warm, and the air is full of fine ash that gets into the eyes and the throat, and makes breathing an effort. The sun has been gone since early afternoon. The darkness is not the darkness of night. Pliny, describing it later from across the water, said it was not like a moonless night or a cloudy one, but like a room that has been shut up with the lamp put out. And there was noise. Continuous, enormous noise. The roar of the column, and the crack of larger fragments hitting roofs, and periodically, the deeper sound of a building giving way. Many people left. This needs saying clearly, because the popular image of Pompeii is a town caught unaware and destroyed at once, and that is not what happened. The eruption gave the Pompeians a warning of many hours, and thousands of them took it. They went out through the gates on the seaward side and along the coast roads, carrying what they could. Some got clear entirely. The population inside the walls was around 10,000, and the number of bodies recovered from Pompeii over 2.5 centuries of excavation is on the order of 1,300. Even allowing for unexcavated areas and for bodies that decayed without trace, the great majority of the town appears to have escaped the first day. But many stayed, and their reasons would have made sense at the time. A homeowner with everything he owned inside 4 walls does not lightly abandon it to a storm. The stone was falling everywhere outside, and the roof, at first, seemed better than no roof. The elderly and the sick could not walk through drifts of pumice. Slaves could not leave without permission, and there was a widespread and reasonable belief, right up to the moment when it stopped being reasonable, that this would pass. They sheltered. They went into interior rooms, into cellars, under stairs, into the vaulted service rooms of the great houses. They put cushions and pillows on their heads and tied them there with cloth, which sounds absurd and was in fact intelligent, because the thing most likely to kill you outdoors at this stage was a falling fragment. And the pumice went on falling, and the roofs began to fail. A tiled Roman roof is a heavy thing already. Load it with 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet of wet, compacting pumice, and the beams break. Through the late afternoon and into the evening, all across Pompeii, roofs came down. That is where a great many of the first deaths happened, in houses where people had done the sensible thing and gone inside. Across the bay at Misenum, Pliny the Elder had ordered a fast boat made ready. His first intention was scientific. He wanted a closer look at the cloud, and he invited his nephew to come with him. The boy declined, saying he preferred to go on with the piece of writing his uncle had set him, which is a detail Pliny, the Younger, includes without comment 25 years later, and which one suspects he never entirely stopped thinking about. Then, as Pliny was leaving the house, a message reached him. A woman named Rectina, who lived in a villa at the foot of the mountain, was trapped. The only escape was by sea, and she was begging for rescue. And here Pliny the Elder becomes something other than an eccentric encyclopedist. He cancelled the small boat, ordered out the warships of the fleet, and went aboard himself. His nephew's phrase is that he changed his plan, and what had begun in a spirit of inquiry, he now carried through in a spirit of heroism. The galleys pulled out of Misenum and across the bay toward the mountain, into a sky that was raining ash. Pliny took notes. His nephew records that as they came closer, the ash falling on the ships grew hotter and thicker, and then pumice began to fall, and then blackened stones cracked and burned. They found the shallows choked with debris from the mountain and the shore unapproachable. The helmsman advised turning back. Pliny told him that fortune favors the brave, and ordered the ships south along the coast to Stabiae, where his friend Pomponianus lived. At Stabiae, 4 miles down the coast from Pompeii and out of the worst of the fall, Pomponianus had already loaded his baggage onto ships and was waiting only for the wind to change so that he could sail. The same wind that was pinning him to the shore had carried Pliny down to him without difficulty. Pliny came ashore, embraced his frightened friend, and then, to calm him, did the most extraordinary thing in the entire account. He asked to be taken to the baths. He bathed. He then sat down and ate dinner, and was, his nephew says, either cheerful or doing a very good imitation of cheerfulness, which his nephew notes is equally admirable. By then it was dark, and from the terraces of Stabiae, the mountain could be seen burning. Broad sheets of flame and tall columns of fire stood out against the blackness, and Pliny told the household that these were bonfires left burning in abandoned farms. Then he went to bed and slept, and his snoring could be heard by the servants outside the door, because he was a large man and slept heavily. Meanwhile, on the far side of the mountain, Herculaneum was still almost untouched. Very little pumice had fallen there, a few centimeters of ash, no more. Its people had spent the day watching the black mass in the sky, feeling the ground shake and deciding what to do. Most of them left the houses and went down to the shore. Along the waterfront at Herculaneum ran a line of vaulted chambers cut into the wall beneath the town, open to the beach, used for storing boats and gear. They were solid, they were roofed with stone, and they were beside the water, where the ships would come. The people of Herculaneum gathered there in the dark, hundreds of them, packed into these arches with whatever they had brought, waiting for rescue by sea. Somewhere out on that black water, 20 miles away, the fleet of Misenum had already sailed and had gone the wrong way. Around midnight, the eruption changed. For roughly 12 hours, the column had held itself up, a self-sustaining engine of gas and heat and shattered rock. But the vent had been widening all day as the rushing mixture scoured it, and as the vent widened, the column drew in more heavy material than it could lift. Somewhere in the small hours it lost the argument with gravity, and part of it collapsed. What comes down when a Plinian column collapses is not a rain of stones. It is a flow. The material, still hundreds of degrees hot, falls back onto the mountain, and then runs down the slopes as a dense ground, hugging avalanche of gas, ash, and rock, moving at speeds that can exceed 100 miles an hour. Volcanologists call these pyroclastic density currents. The hotter, more dilute upper part of such a flow is called a surge, and it is the surge, not the dense flow beneath it, that does most of the killing because it can go over walls. The first surge came off the mountain in the direction of Herculaneum. It reached the town in something like 4 minutes. There was no possibility of outrunning it, and no possibility of sheltering from it, because unlike falling stone, it did not care about roofs. It entered every opening. Estimates of its temperature at Herculaneum range from about 400 to 500 degrees Celsius, and at that temperature death is instantaneous. Soft tissue vaporizes, fluid in the body boils. The bones of the people found on the waterfront show. Cracking in color changes consistent with sudden extreme heat. And in some skulls, the residue that has been identified appears to be brain matter turned to glass by the speed of the temperature change. They were found in the boat chambers in the 1980s and the years after, more than 300 of them, lying in the postures they held at the instant it arrived. Families together. A woman with a child. A man who has been identified from his belt, his sword, his tools, and his physique as a soldier, lying face down on the beach with a bag of carpenter's equipment. On the sand nearby lay the skeleton of a horse. Behind the surge came the dense flow, and then another and another, 6 in all through the rest of the night. They filled Herculaneum from the ground up, poured into the streets, through the doors and windows, up the stairs, over the rooftops, and finally over the entire town, until it lay beneath something like 20 meters of hot volcanic material that cooled and set as hard as concrete. It is that burial that preserved the wood. The material arrived hot enough to carbonize timber, but arrived so fast and packed so densely that there was no oxygen for it to burn. So the beams charred and stayed, the doors charred and stayed. The scrolls in the Villa of the Papyri charred and stayed, black and brittle and unreadable, holding their words inside them for 2,000 years. Herculaneum was gone before dawn, and everyone still in it was dead. And 10 miles away in Pompeii, where the pumice was now nearly 3 meters deep, and people were still alive in the buried rooms of their houses, the surges had not yet come. Consider what the night was like inside Pompeii. The pumice had been falling for 12 hours. It lay 2.5 to 3 meters deep in the streets, higher against the buildings, and it was still coming. Every ground floor doorway in the town was blocked. In many houses, people had retreated upward as the lower rooms filled, and were now on upper floors, or in attics with the stone piling against the outside walls to the level of their windows. In others, the roof had already gone, and they were in the dark under a broken ceiling with the rubble around them. The air was thick, not yet lethal, but foul with fine ash and sulfur, and every breath had grit in it. There were shocks in the ground, hard ones, more frequent than before. There was no light except what a lamp gave, and lamps were burning out. Anyone who put his head out of a window saw nothing at all, except perhaps a dull red glow high up on the invisible mountain. Some of them made a decision in those hours. There is a group of bodies in an orchard in the southeastern quarter of the town. 13 people, found together where the wall of the garden meets a doorway, adults and children among them. They had come out into the open at some point during the night and were moving through the deep pumice toward the Nucerian gate, and they did not get there. They are known now as the Garden of the Fugitives, and the casts of them lie under a shelter in the place where they fell, in a row, in the attitudes of people brought down while walking. Others had stayed put and were waiting. In the house of the Menander, 10 people had gathered in a corridor near the service rooms, with a lantern and a pick and a hoe, apparently intending to dig their way out when it grew light. In the villa at Oplontis, more than 50 people had crowded into a room by the shore, some of them with jewelry and coins, and one with a small fortune in gold. In the great suburban villa of the Mysteries, they had gone into the vaulted lower story. Then, roughly between 1 and 2 in the morning, the second surge came down. It did not reach Pompeii. It stopped, according to the deposits, somewhere on the northern slopes above the town. So did the third. The fourth came further, and it reached the walls of Pompeii, and it went over them. It was cooler than the flows that had killed Herculaneum. By the time it had traveled 10 kilometers from the vent, it had probably fallen to somewhere between 200 and 300 degrees. That is still an impossible temperature. It arrived in the town in a matter of a minute or two, poured through the streets and over the drifts of pumice, forced itself into every space that had air in it, and killed everyone in its path. The pattern of the bodies tells you how it happened. There is very little sign of struggle. Most of the people caught by the surge are found in postures that suggest they were overcome where they stood or lay. And the specialists who have examined the skeletons argue that the cause of death was overwhelmingly thermal shock rather than suffocation. The hands and feet of many casts are drawn up in the contraction that intense heat produces in the muscles after death. That posture has been misread for 150 years as agony. It is not. It happened afterward. 2 more surges followed the fourth, and these were larger, and they buried the town. When they were finished, Pompeii lay beneath about 6 meters of material in total, roughly 4 of pumice and 2 of fine ash. And the surface where the ash settled was a smooth gray plain, with almost nothing standing above it except the tops of a few of the tallest buildings and the upper part of the town wall. The whole thing had taken about 18 hours. Nobody now knows how many died in Pompeii. The recovered figure is around 1,300, but large parts of the site have never been dug, and the surrounding countryside, where refugees were caught on the roads, has been sampled only in fragments. Estimates for the total loss across the whole buried region, including Herculaneum, Oplantis, Stabii, the villas and the farms and the people caught fleeing, run from around 2,000 to well over 10,000, and there is no way to settle it. The one thing that can be said with confidence is that anyone still within about 15 kilometers of the mountain on the morning of the second day was dead. Among them was the admiral of the fleet. At Stabii, Pliny the Elder had gone to sleep and the household had not. As the night went on, the courtyard outside his room filled with pumice to the point where his companions realized that if they let him sleep any longer, he would not be able to get the door open at all. They woke him. He came out and joined the others, and they held a discussion about what to do. The house was shaking now, hard, with shocks that made the buildings seem to rock on their foundations. Staying indoors meant risking collapse. Going outside meant the falling stone. They chose outside, and they took the same precaution the people of Pompeii had taken, tying pillows over their heads with cloth. It was, Pliny's nephew notes, daylight everywhere else by now. At Stabii, it was still night, and blacker than any night, and they carried torches and lamps. They went down to the shore to see whether the sea had calmed enough to launch, and it had not. The water was running out and back in a way that made no sense, and the shore was littered with sea creatures left stranded. Pliny lay down on a sheet that had been spread for him, asked twice for cold water, and drank it. Then came flames, and a smell of sulfur that drove the others to their feet and into flight. This was the arrival of a surge along the coast, weakened by distance but carrying gas and heat, and it seems to have been fatal to him. His nephew's account is careful, and one senses the care. He says his uncle was helped to his feet by 2 slaves and immediately collapsed, and that his own view was that the thick fumes had blocked his breathing and closed a windpipe that was naturally weak and narrow, and often troubled him. When daylight returned at last, on the 3rd day, his body was found where he had fallen, undamaged and uninjured and fully clothed, looking, the nephew says, more like a man asleep than a dead one. There is a modern argument that a man of 55, overweight, asthmatic, who had spent a day and a night breathing volcanic ash, might simply have suffered a heart attack. And this is likely true. It changes nothing. He had taken a fleet across a bay to fetch people off a burning shore, and he had died on that shore, and the last thing he did before he lay down was ask for water and drink it, as though everything were normal. 20 miles away, at Misenum, his sister and his nephew had spent the night in a different kind of fear. Pliny, the younger's second letter to Tacitus, describes it, and it is a quieter, and in some ways a more affecting document than the first, because he is no longer writing about a hero. He is writing about a frightened teenage boy, which is what he was. After his uncle sailed, he went back to his book. He had, he says, been the one who asked for it, so he could hardly abandon it. He took a bath, ate, and lay down to a restless and short sleep. The tremors had been going on for days, and everyone had stopped attending to them. But that night they became so violent that things did not merely shake, but seemed to be turning over. His mother came into his room. He was on his way to hers. They sat in the courtyard between the house and the sea, and he called for a volume of Livy and went on reading and even making extracts from it, as he had been doing before, and here he adds the wonderful line that he does not know whether to call this courage or stupidity, considering his age. A friend of his uncle's, who had come from Spain, saw them there and was appalled. He scolded them both, the mother for allowing it and the boy for permitting it, and told them they should be getting out. They stayed. By first light, the buildings around them were so badly shaken that in the open courtyard, narrow as it was, a collapse seemed certain. They decided at last to leave the town. A crowd came out with them, terrified people pushing from behind, and once outside they found that carts, on perfectly level ground, were rolling back and forth and could not be held still, even with stones under the wheels. They saw the sea sucked away from the shore and left a wide expanse of sand with stranded sea creatures on it. Then a black cloud came across the water from the direction of the mountain, split by long crooked shapes of fire that he compares to lightning but much larger. The friend from Spain urged them again to run. Pliny's mother, who was heavy and slow, begged her son to leave her and save himself, and told him that at 17 he could escape, but she would be content to die if she had not caused his death. He took her hand and made her come, and told her, in a sentence that is not quite a joke, that he would not be saved without her. Then the ash arrived, and the darkness. He describes people calling out for one another in it, parents for children, husbands for wives, recognizing each other by voice alone. Some prayed for death, many raised their hands to the gods, and more concluded there were no gods anywhere anymore, and that this was the last eternal night of the world. He remarks dryly that there were people adding invented terrors to the real ones. They sat down in the road and shook the ash off themselves at intervals, because otherwise they would have been covered and crushed by the weight of it. And then, eventually, the darkness thinned to something like smoke, and real daylight came back, and the sun even shone, weakly, the way it shines during an eclipse. Everything they could see was changed, and buried under ash as though under snow. They went back to Misenum and spent an anxious night there, still shaking with aftershocks, still expecting the worst, and he says that he and his mother refused to leave until they had news of his uncle. And then at the end of the letter he tells Tacitus that none of this is fit for history, and that Tacitus need not use any of it, and that he only wrote it because he was asked. It is the only description we have. The historians who could have written the real account did not, or their work is lost. The chronicler Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, gives a version full of giants seen wandering the mountain, and reports that the ash reached Africa and Syria and Egypt, and that it fell in Rome, filling the air and blocking the sun, and that people there thought the whole world was being turned upside down. When the sky cleared over the Bay of Naples, the survivors came back to look, and there was nothing to look at. The coastline itself had moved. At Herculaneum, the volcanic deposits had pushed the shore some 400 meters out into the sea, so that the little harbor where the people had waited for boats was now buried inland. The river Sarno, which had carried Pompeii's barges down to the port, had been choked and had changed its course. The whole southern face of the mountain was a gray desert. Streams were blocked, and in the months and years that followed the rains, coming off that bare surface caused floods and mudflows that reworked the landscape again. Pompeii was a plain. A few roof ridges and the tops of the taller columns stood above the ash, enough that anyone who had known the town could work out where the Forum had been, and that was all. And people did come back because they knew where things were. Almost immediately, and for a long time afterward, holes were driven into the buried towns. Modern excavators find them constantly. Tunnels cut through the hardened ash from room to room, walls broken through at the exact points where a doorway would have been on the other side. Whoever dug them knew the standard layout of a Roman house well enough to navigate it blind. They went for the valuables. Bronze statues were taken. Marble was stripped off walls. The great public buildings around the Forum were systematically cleared of their statuary and their facings, so thoroughly that when the site was properly excavated in modern times, the Forum was found stripped nearly bare, which caused a good deal of confusion until the tunnels were understood. Some of this was official salvage. Some was straightforward robbery. Some of it, surely, was survivors going down into the ash to recover what had been theirs, or their families, with a pick and a lamp, and a very precise memory of which room the strongbox stood in. There is at least one place where a tunneler left a message scratched on a wall, and it reads, in Latin, that the house is empty. What became of the people who got out? For a long time the answer was that nobody knew, and then a historian went looking systematically, and the answer turned out to be recoverable in outline. Refugees from a destroyed town carry their names with them, and Roman names are traceable. Family names that are common in Pompeii and Herculaneum and rare elsewhere start appearing after the year 79 in the towns around the northern part of the bay. They cluster at Cumae, at Naples, at Puteoli, at Ostia. Some of these people appear in inscriptions holding local office within a generation, which means they arrived with money or made it fast. There are hints of organized resettlement. Public buildings went up in some of these towns in the years right afterward, paid for from imperial funds, and the pattern looks like a state responding to a large influx of displaced people who needed housing and work. The Emperor Titus himself took the disaster seriously. He was 10 weeks into his reign. He appointed a commission of former consuls, chosen by lot, to manage relief. He gave money from the imperial treasury, and he assigned the property of those who had died without heirs to the rebuilding of the surviving communities of the region. He visited the area twice, once immediately, and once the following year. The chronicler Suetonius records that during his short reign, Titus faced this eruption, a fire that burned for 3 days and nights in Rome, and one of the worst plagues that had ever been known, and that he handled all three with a kind of parental attentiveness, and that he took nothing from anyone. Then, having done all that, Titus died in September of the year 81, at 41, after a reign of 2 years and 2 months, and Pompeii began to disappear from the record. The road system was rerouted around the dead zone. The land above the buried towns went back to agriculture within a few generations. because volcanic ash weathers into superb soil, and the same fertility that had drawn people there in the first place brought them back to farm the graves of their grandparents. A map of the Roman road network drawn up in late antiquity still marks a place called Pompeii in roughly the right area, so the name was not immediately lost. But the town was. By the Middle Ages, the location was genuinely forgotten. The hill above the site was known locally as La Civita, which suggests a folk memory that there had been a city there, and nobody did anything about it. Vesuvius erupted again, many times in 472, in 512, in 1631 with terrible loss of life, and each time it laid more material over the top. Farms and vineyards covered the ash. The story of the town survived only in books, in Pliny's letters, and in a few scattered references, read by scholars who had no idea where the place had stood. It stayed buried for 16 centuries. The rediscovery, when it came, was an accident, and it happened at Herculaneum first. In 1709, an Austrian prince named Delboeuf was building a villa near the town of Resina, on the coast north of Pompeii, and he wanted marble. He heard that a local man digging a well had struck worked stone at a great depth. The prince bought the land, sank shafts, and drove tunnels out from the bottom. And what his workmen had broken into was the stage building of the theater of Herculaneum, 60 feet below the surface, filled solid with rock. They pulled out marble facings and columns and statues and sold or gave them away across Europe for the better part of a decade, until the authorities in Naples stopped it. In 1738, Charles of Bourbon, King of Naples, restarted the work as a royal enterprise, this time with an engineer in charge and a proper record kept. The tunnels went deeper into Herculaneum. In 1750, they broke into the villa of the papyri and began to bring out bronze statues of astonishing quality, and then the library, whose carbonized scrolls were at first taken for lumps of charcoal and used, according to one story, as fuel. And in 1748, on the strength of local reports and some earlier finds made when a canal was cut through the area, the same royal engineers put their spades into the ash at La Civita and found painted walls almost at once. They did not know what they had. For years, the site was assumed to be the Roman town of Stabiae. Only in 1763 was an inscription found that named the town explicitly, and the identification became certain. The early digging was, by any modern standard, appalling. It was treasure hunting on behalf of a monarch. Tunnels were driven to find paintings. The best panels were cut out of the walls and carried off to the royal collection, and the rest was often deliberately damaged so that nobody else could profit from it. Objects were removed without any record of where they had lain. Rooms were emptied and backfilled. The king kept the finds in a palace, closed to most visitors, and forbade drawing or publication for a long time because the collection's value lay partly in its exclusivity. And yet, even mangled, what came out of the ground changed Europe. Nobody in the 18th century had ever seen ancient painting. Classical art was known through sculpture, mostly Roman copies, mostly white marble stripped of its original color. Then, out of the ash, came rooms. Walls painted floor to ceiling in reds and blacks and golds, with landscapes, still lifes, portraits, gods, architectural fantasies, garden scenes with birds so specific that ornithologists can identify the species. Lamps, cooking pots, surgical instruments, jewelry, furniture, a whole material world that had been theorized and never seen. The German scholar Johann Joachim Winckelmann came to look and was furious at how it was being done, and said so publicly, and his letters about the excavations did as much as anything to spread the news across the continent. Artists came. Goethe came, twice, and wrote that of all the disasters in the world, few had given so much pleasure to posterity. English gentlemen on the Grand Tour came and went home and rebuilt their houses in the Pompeian manner. Josiah Wedgwood put the shapes and colors of the finds onto pottery and sold them across Europe. An entire style, which we still call neoclassical, drew its details from these rooms. The buried towns had come back into the world as an image, and the image was of a lost paradise of taste and light, which is not really what they had been at all. The change came in 1863, when a man named Giuseppe Fiorelli was put in charge. Fiorelli was a numismatist and archaeologist of a new kind, and he had ideas that now seem obvious and were then revolutionary. He stopped the tunneling and insisted that the town be excavated from the top downward, so that walls and upper stories and the position of collapsed material could be understood rather than destroyed on the way in. He divided the site into regions and blocks and gave every entrance a number, a system still in use today, which meant that for the first time, every object could be recorded with an address. He insisted that finds stay on site where possible. He opened the excavation to the public and charged an entrance fee, and he worked out what to do about the holes. Diggers had been encountering them for a century. In the deep, fine ash there were cavities, empty spaces of irregular shape, and often at the bottom of them were human bones. What had happened was this. The final surges had buried the bodies in ash so fine that it took an impression of every fold of cloth and every curl of hair, and then that ash had set. Inside the shell, the body decayed away over the centuries, leaving a void in the exact shape of the person at the moment of death, with the skeleton lying loose within it. Earlier excavators had occasionally noticed the shapes and had made crude attempts at pouring something in. Fiorelli made it a method. When a cavity was found, the workmen stopped, drilled small holes into it, poured in liquid plaster, waited for it to set, and then chipped away the surrounding ash. What emerged on the 5th of February 1863 was 4 human beings. They are still among the most difficult things to look at in the whole of archaeology, and they are difficult for a specific reason. They are not skeletons which we are used to, and which allow a comfortable distance. They are not statues, which are made by an artist with intentions. They are the shape of the empty air where a person used to be, and they show what the ash showed, which is everything: the fall of a sleeve, a sandal, a hand raised toward the face, a woman with her dress caught up and her hair still pinned, a man lying on his side with one arm under his head, a child. Over the following decades, many more were cast. There is the group in the orchard. There are the 2 people, once described as sisters, who lie with their arms around one another, and whose sexes and relationship have both been revised more than once as the science improved. There is the household dog from the house of Orpheus, still wearing a studded collar, twisted onto its back with its legs in the air, which was chained to a post and could not get away, and which is, for a great many visitors, the single hardest thing in Pompeii. The casts are also, it has to be said, artifacts of the 19th century as much as of the first. Some were tidied. Some were arranged and posed for photographs. Some, in the earliest days, had faces reworked with a modeling tool to make them more legible, and museums have spent a long time working out which. Modern conservation of the casts now includes computed tomography scanning, which lets researchers see the bones inside the plaster without opening it, and recover age, health, dental condition, injuries, and increasingly DNA. That work has been quietly demolishing a number of the stories that were told about these people for 150 years. The 2 embracing figures, long presented as sisters or as a mother and daughter, turn out from genetic analysis to include at least one adult male unrelated to the other. A figure identified for generations as a mother holding her child is genetically an adult male. and the child is not his son. The interpretations were not lies. They were the assumptions of the people looking, projected onto shapes that could not argue back. It is a useful lesson about the whole site. The excavation of Pompeii has now been going on, with pauses, for more than 275 years, and it has never stopped being a mirror for whoever is doing it. After Fiorelli came a long succession of directors, each with a program. In the early 20th century, work concentrated on clearing whole streets to their full height and leaving houses roofed and furnished in place, so that visitors could walk into rooms rather than look down into cleared shells. The greatest of these directors, Amedeo Maiuri, ran the site for nearly 40 years from the 1920s, uncovered enormous areas including the Villa of the Mysteries and much of the southern town, and dug beneath the year 79 level for the first time to find the earlier centuries underneath. Then came the war. In August and September of 1943, the site was bombed repeatedly by Allied aircraft, which had mistaken the ruins for a German position, or in some accounts believed that troops and vehicles were concealed among them. More than 150 bombs fell on Pompeii. The museum was hit and much of its contents destroyed. Roofs put up to protect the paintings came down. Several houses were wrecked outright. What had survived a volcano was damaged by aircraft, and the repairs afterward were made quickly and cheaply, and a good deal of what a visitor now sees in certain streets is 1940s masonry. And after the war came the slower crisis, which is simply this: a buried building is stable. An unburied one is not. The ash had held Pompeii in a condition of suspended animation. The moment it was removed, the ordinary enemies of masonry were let in. Rain-washed lime out of mortar, frost-cracked plaster, sun-bleached pigment that had lain in the dark for 2,000 years. Vegetation rooted in the tops of walls and levered them apart. Tourists, by the millions, wore paths into floors and touched what they were told not to touch. By the end of the 20th century, something like 2/3 of the town had been uncovered, and a great deal of it was falling down faster than anyone could repair it. In 2010, the Schola Armaturarum, a large building on the main street, collapsed entirely overnight after heavy rain. It made news around the world and provoked something close to a national scandal in Italy. And out of that came the Great Pompeii Project, a large program of consolidation funded substantially by the European Union, which, over the following decade, stabilized the excavated areas, restored drainage, put roofs back on, and crucially, established that the priority for the foreseeable future is not to dig more, but to hold what has already been dug. Which is why, and this surprises most people, roughly 1/3 of Pompeii has still never been excavated at all. There is a large area in the north and northeast of the town, tens of acres, that lies under the ash exactly as it has since the year 79. It has been deliberately left. Every generation of archaeologists is better equipped than the last, and every acre opened is an acre that begins to decay. So the reasoning is to leave it for people with better tools and better questions. Even so, controlled work continues, and it keeps producing extraordinary things. In recent years, digging along the edge of the unexcavated zone to stabilize the face where old and new meet, excavators have found a house with a fresco of 2 figures that a headline writer immediately called an ancient pizza, and which is in fact a flatbread with fruit and something like pesto beside a wine cup. They have found the charcoal inscription that may have redated the eruption. They have found a room in a villa outside the walls, small and windowless, with a simple wooden bed with rope webbing, a chamber pot, an amphora, and a chest, and no decoration at all, which is almost certainly a slave dwelling, and which tells us more about the reality of Pompeii than any painted dining room. They have found a ceremonial chariot, four-wheeled, decorated with bronze and tin medallions, standing in the portico of a suburban villa where it was left. They have found a bakery with a room whose windows were barred and whose floor was cut with indentations, to keep the millstone animals moving in their circle, in which people and donkeys had worked together in conditions that the excavator described plainly as slavery. They have found a banqueting hall with black walls painted with scenes from the Trojan War, chosen, an expert suggested, so that the smoke of the lamps would not show, and they have found more of the dead, and every time it is the same encounter. In 2020, in a corridor of a villa at Civita Giuliana, just outside the walls, they found two men who had died together in the surge of the second morning. One was between about 30 and 40, well-built, wearing a woolen cloak with a spine showing the compression of heavy physical labor. The other was between about 18 and 23, wearing a tunic. The bones of the younger man's spine and the state of his teeth suggested hard work from a young age. The likelihood is that they were master and slave, or two men of very different station, who ran together and were caught in the same doorway. That is Pompeii's real subject, and it took 2 centuries to bring it into focus. For most of the site's modern life, it was presented as a place of beauty and luxury. The paintings went to museums. The villas were the attraction. The story told about the town was essentially aesthetic, a lost world of elegant rooms and mythological scenes, with a tragic ending attached. But Pompeii is not a museum of Roman art. It is the only complete Roman town we possess, and its overwhelming value is that it preserved everything, and everything includes the parts nobody chose to record. It gives us bakeries and their donkey mills. It gives us the graffiti of the illiterate and the semi-literate, whose spelling is wrong and whose handwriting is bad and who wrote anyway. It gives us the drains and what was in them. It gives us the ruts in the paving that show exactly which streets carried the heaviest traffic and which were quiet. It gives us the bar counters and the food in them. It gives us the small barred room with the rope bed. It gives us, in other words, the 90% of Roman society that Roman literature almost entirely ignores, because Roman literature was written by aristocrats for aristocrats. Every other Roman site was cleaned out, robbed, rebuilt or abandoned slowly, and slow abandonment is the great destroyer, because people take everything of value with them when they go. Pompeii was stopped mid-sentence, and what it shows when you read it that way is a town that is much less refined and much more alive than the 18th century wanted it to be. It is loud. It is dirty. The streets are used as drains. The great houses have shops built into their frontages and rented out for cash. And often you can see where a rich family's dining room wall backs directly onto a foolery that stank. Elegant residences stand next to bakeries and brothels because zoning did not exist, and status was expressed vertically, in the height of your ceilings and the depth of your entrance hall, not horizontally by moving to a better district. The paintings, too, look different when you stop treating them as gallery pieces. They are decoration. They were produced by workshops to a range of standard patterns at various price points, by painters who worked fast and who sometimes got things wrong. In half-finished rooms you can see the process, the plaster laid on in sections that had to be painted while it was still wet, the guidelines snapped with a chalked string, the figures blocked in by a specialist who came in to do the central panel while apprentices did the borders. It is a trade, and a well-organized one, and knowing that makes the good pieces better, not worse. There is a last thing the town does, which no amount of scholarship will ever quite domesticate. Every visitor who walks up from the Marine Gate on a hot afternoon has the same experience about 20 minutes in. and it is not awe. It is recognition. It is a set of stepping stones worn in the middle where 2,000 years of feet have crossed. It is a shop counter with a hole cut for the coins. It is a doorway with a dog painted on the floor in mosaic, and the words "Beware of the dog" put there as a joke or as a warning or as both. It is a name scratched at eye level in a corridor. It is the fact that the town is small and human-sized, and that the distance from a bar to a bathhouse is the distance you would want it to be. And then, at some point, you come around a corner and there is the mountain, filling the sky at the end of the street, exactly where it was. And you understand that these people looked up at it every single day of their lives, from the fountain and the doorway and the roof terrace, and that it was simply the view. Vesuvius is still there, and it is still active, and this is not an academic point. It has erupted many times since the year 79. There was a violent eruption in 1631 that killed several thousand people and buried villages under lava and mud. There was a long period through the 18th and 19th centuries when the mountain was almost continuously in mild activity, with a glowing cone at the summit that became one of the standard sights of the Grand Tour, painted and sketched by half the artists in Europe. There was a major eruption in 1906 and another in 1944, in the middle of the war, which destroyed 2 villages, and a squadron of American aircraft parked at a nearby airfield, and which was photographed and filmed by Allied servicemen who stood and watched the lava come down. Since 1944, it has been silent, and that is the part that worries the people whose job it is to worry. Vesuvius is not a mountain that vents itself gently. Long, quiet periods allow pressure and gas to build in the system, and the longer the quiet, the more violent the eventual return tends to be. The eruption of the year 79 followed a silence of several centuries. Today, around 3 million people live in the metropolitan area around the mountain, and something over 500,000 of them live inside the zone that would have to be evacuated. The Italian authorities maintain an emergency plan built around getting those people out in about 72 hours, matched to a monitoring system of seismometers and gas sensors and satellite measurements of ground deformation that watches the mountain continuously from an observatory founded in 1841, the oldest volcano observatory in the world. Nobody expects to be surprised the way the Pompeians were. The signals that preceded the year 79, the swarms of small earthquakes, the changes in the springs, would today be visible for weeks or months in advance, and would be understood for what they are. That is the difference between then and now, and it is the only difference that matters. The mountain has not changed. We have simply learned to read it, which brings us back at the end to the town itself. Let the site empty. The last coach leaves in the early evening and the gates close, and the streets that carry 30,000 people on a summer day go quiet. The stones give back their heat. Lizards come out onto the walls. Swallows work the open ground where the amphitheater sits in its hollow, and the grass in the great palestra beside it moves in whatever wind is coming off the sea. Walk it in your mind one last time, the way it was. Down the long straight of the Via dell'Abbondanza, past the shuttered bars with their counters and their jars, past the foolery with its vats, past the election notices still bright on the plaster, past the doorway with the dog, past the fountain on the corner, worn on one side where thousands of hands took hold of the stone to lean in and drink, past the bakery where the loaves are in the oven and the mill stands ready for the morning. Into the forum, empty of carts, the bollards at the entrances, the colonnade running down both sides, and at the far end the temple on its high podium with the scaffolding still up after 17 years of slow repair. Out through the Herculaneum Gate and along the Street of Tombs, where the dead sit up close to the road on their benches, still asking passers-by to remember their names and how many gladiators they paid for. And all of it under that green mountain, quiet, ordinary, going about the business of a Tuesday. They did not know. That is the whole of it. They had no reason to know, and they were not careless or foolish. And the town they built was a good town, well-watered, well-governed by its own lights, full of people arguing about elections and complaining about the wine and scratching their names on walls so that somebody would know they had been there. Somebody knows. That is the strange consolation of Pompeii, if there is one. Of the millions upon millions of people who lived in the Roman world, we know the names of a tiny handful, mostly emperors and generals and poets. And then there is this one small town where we know the name of the man who sold fish sauce, and the woman who advertised her baths, and the boy whose father bought him a seat on the council with a temple, and the fighter the girls sighed over, and the person who complained that the walls had not yet fallen down under the weight of all the nonsense written on them. And here the story settles. The mountain is quiet tonight, and the streets below it are quiet, and the ash that took a city has given it back to us almost whole, held in the dark for 1,600 years the way a hand holds something fragile. The names grow soft, the years drift like dust in a shaft of evening light. Let the town keep its long sleep, and let the sea go on turning over on the shore below it, as it did that morning and every morning since. Rest now, let it all go quiet. Sleep well, and good night.